may she live and be well, is losing her memory. She's not terribly old. She's in her mid 80s, but her mind is going. And it's difficult for those of us who love her and remember how strong and courageous and sharp she was. Um, and it's also painful because she's the last in her generation, at least in my family, who embodies, just by her being, that memory of our family. I shared on Pesach that Seders for my family growing up were filled with survivors. Around the Seder table, there were the sounds of Galicianer Yiddish, kiloi nue, kiloi yue was how we would sing it. And I thought that was normal. I thought that was how the song was sung. It was only when I got to day school with my Israeli teachers who said, that's not how those words are pronounced. And I said, no, you're wrong. That's exactly how they're pronounced in my family. And as I try to cherish every minute I have with my Bubi while she walks this earth, and I see my own children, my oldest, who's learning about the Holocaust through, in the way that second graders learn about the Holocaust, who wants to know, what was it like for you to survive the war? And those were my questions when I was his age. I wanted to know, and sometimes she'd share and sometimes she wouldn't, and sometimes Zadie would share and most of the time he wouldn't. But I'm also seeing that she's just not capable anymore of sharing those memories. And so my kids won't have that firsthand experience that I had. So that imposes upon me and my mother and my sisters this incredible responsibility, which is that we become the keepers of the memory. So I make it a commitment here tonight, as we talk about memory, as we think about our responsibility, to think about how we energize a third generation to keep going this project of memory that is so important to our history, but also, I believe, to our future. At this time, I want to call upon Alan Zaks, a member of our community, who's going to introduce our speaker for tonight.
There we go.
Thank you, Judy, for unmuting us. Thank you, Rabbi, for sharing your thoughts. Very moving. Over 40 years ago, my cousin Jerry had the foresight to talk with his parents about and to talk and record the conversations with his parents about their lives in Poland before, during, and after the Holocaust. Those recordings have become the basis for tonight's presentation. Jerry's father was Saul Zaks, known to my brother and I as Uncle Shoel. And Shoel's older brother, Cy Zaks, my father, was known to cousin Jerry and his brother Irv as Uncle Shia. The Zaks brothers grew up in Będzin, Poland, as did my mother, a small city with a population of about half Jewish in that city. And Shoel and Shia's father, our paternal grandfather, was Gershon Zaks, for whom both cousin Jerry and my brother Jerry are named. So yes, there are two Jerry Zakses. I love them both very much. I want to thank Susan Work and Judy and Steve Elbaum for having cousin Jerry at this year's Yom HaShoah program. Coincidentally, the Elbaum family, the ancestors of the Elbaum family, as well as fellow Agudath Israel congregants Jack Plauner and Helen Maxman, are from Będzin, Poland. So we have a nice contingent representing here at Agudath. So at this point, I want to turn it over to my dear cousin Jerry for what I think you're going to find a very, very interesting and moving program.
Well, thank you, very much, Alan. I did not pay him to do any of that, by the way. I want to share my screen, and I want to thank everybody for coming. I hope you gained something out of it and enjoyed the talk, learned something, hopefully, and thank you for the opportunity. I just want to make sure. Okay, I'm sharing sound. So, hello everyone. As my cousin Alan said, my name is Jerry Zacks, and I am a second generation Holocaust survivor, which means both my father, Saul Zacks on the left, and my mother, Bertha Goldstein, survived numerous concentration and labor camps. And my father actually endured 3 death marches. Tonight, I'm going to be going through both stories that I've learned over the years, as well as 3.5 years of detailed research to try and put the pieces together and really understand the story.
Jerry, you have to unmute. Jerry, I'm sorry, you're muted. I don't know why. Yeah.
Wow. So no one heard anything.
Yeah.
No, we did.
Started screen sharing.
We only
It's
didn't hear
not
your
on
last
there.
2
It's not on.
sentences.
Okay. So thank you everybody for helping out, but stay muted, and Jerry, you take back over. You take back.
Muted.
Oh, now you have to screen share again.
I know, but I've shut down my presentation. I'm so sorry.
We don't hear the last like 2 seconds.
Okay. So everybody, don't worry.
You didn't hear the last?
Just the last 2 sentences.
Is what you heard?
Is what we didn't hear. The
Oh, I
rest was
wonder
all
why
good.
I stopped sharing. Okay, so I'm very sorry. My wife's telling me that you actually heard most of what I said. So skip to this slide. And before I actually go into the details of their story, of my parents' story, I'd like everybody to reflect on what they think of when they hear the Holocaust. To many people, it's numbers. You hear the word Holocaust and you think of 6 million Jews murdered. Sometimes the thing that first comes to mind when you hear the word Holocaust is it's death camps and concentration camps. Words like Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau and Dachau. And to many people, it's images of people being hoarded into cattle car trains and having Star of David sewn onto their outer clothing. And in many cases, people think of Nazi Germany's propaganda machine, posters that Jews were to blame for World War I, and the infamous slogan of the final solution. And although all of this is true and all of these are legitimate thoughts, what I would want for people to think about when they hear the word Holocaust is that what it is it's about blind and unjustified hate. It's hate of race, hate of religion, simply hate of people who do not think like you. It's about families who were torn apart and destroyed. And mostly, it's about people. It's about people's stories and people who, well, lost their lives, lost their families, and in some miraculous cases like mine, with fortitude and some luck, were able to survive the Holocaust. During my presentation, we're going to be following a timeline which will always be shown on the top of each slide. And we're going to start in 1937. Why do I pick 1937 as a place to start? Well, first of all, the simplest reason is it's some of the earliest pictures I have of my family. But it's more than that, actually. In 1937, we're about 5.5 years after the Great Depression in Europe. Times were turning around. The economy was bouncing back. People were beginning to live happy and fulfilled lives. In Będzin, Poland, and in Low Poland, where both my parents grew up, they were middle-class people living, again, happy and fulfilled lives. All the way here on the left is my mother, circled in yellow. She's 17 years old at this time. She's studying bookkeeping in high school, and she's out at a swimming gathering with her friends from high school. Her father, here in the middle, he is actually the manager of the town's railway station, and later on, he actually starts and owns a successful grocery store in Low Poland. On the right is the Zaks family. My father is now 18 years old in 1937, circled in yellow. For Alan, for everybody who knows Alan, this person all the way here on the right is my Uncle Shia, Alan's father. And seated in the middle is my paternal grandfather. His Polish name is Herzlich Zaks, and his Yiddish name, as Alan said, was Gershon Zaks, who I and my other cousin is named after. But they're more than just middle class, living a good life. My grandfather and my father are running the butcher business for the family. And my grandfather is actually a leader in the Butchers Artisan Guild in Będzin, Poland. So he's a pretty well-known guy and has a pretty good amount of importance in the town. And Hitler, they knew what was going on in Germany. They certainly knew the rise of Hitler, but it was foreign to them. It was 2 years away when Hitler will start World War II by invading Poland. So people, think of yourselves at 17 and 18 years old and how you lived your life and how things were good and how you looked forward to the future. We'll now jump 2 years. My mother's now 19 years old. She's graduated school and she's working as a bookkeeper in a local factory. The factory happens to be just a few blocks away from her father's grocery store, and which is also just a few blocks away from their home. And every day my mother would leave work at lunch, pick up her mother at the grocery store where she worked, and they'd walk together home for lunch. And on one particular Friday, I'd like you to hear my mother's, and this is from the audio recordings I made back in 1980, my mother's account of what happened one Friday afternoon.
I used to work close to the house, and it was a half a block to our store. So I used to go to the store, and my mother used to take me home, and we had lunch. And then on Friday, the 1st of September, 39, I was walking home with my mother. And all of a sudden, we saw planes. And the planes were throwing things down. And I said to my mother, I said, Ma, they are bombs. And she says, you're crazy. They're making this on the exercise. I put the two of them together, and I said, there must be war. And the bombings were insane.
So one of the things that happened a while, not too long ago when I retired and I was doing a transcription of all of the work, of all the audio recordings, was my mother relating this story and rattles just off the top of her head this date of Friday, September 1st that she has ingrained in her memory. So I turned to Google during my research and I just asked Google, when did the Nazis invade Poland and when did World War II start? And along with numerous articles and images, I get this headline from the New York Times dated Friday, September 1st, that Germany attacks Poland. So it was just very interesting during all of my research to get this corroboration between stories that I heard from my parents and actual news articles. So in early September 1939, the world changes and my parents' life changes. That same week, my father in Będzin, Poland, which is very close to the German border at that time, the Germans actually are marching into town. And I'd like you to hear my father's recollection of the Będzin Great Synagogue.
Oh, then they came in. The first thing was the kids German. They're going to school. We used to have a school in our town like a church. Something gorgeous to see. We don't see a school like this.
So what my father doesn't mention is that when the Germans marched into Będzin, about 80 or so people rushed into the synagogue to try and save the Torahs and other memorabilia in the synagogue. And the Germans locked them in and set the synagogue on fire, killing everybody inside the synagogue. Anybody trying to escape through windows and doors were shot. And the Germans also destroyed and burned down about 50 homes in the surrounding area, which were totally owned by Jews in the area. You can see here on the left an early picture of the synagogue with the Bendine Castle up on the hill. And here's the same angle after the war. And you can see that the synagogue is gone, as well as the entire surrounding area. So we move on for the next 3 years, and things progressively get worse and worse between 39 and 1942. Over that time, life is getting worse and worse for Jews. Jews are no longer can work in the government, and my maternal grandfather lost his job managing the railroad station. Businesses and homes were looted and taken away. Jews had to be registered, and then they actually had to wear yellow stars of David on their outer clothing. And they lost their homes and were forced into ghettos. And ultimately, things came down to multiple pogroms. There was a famous pogrom of 1941 in Low Poland that my mother endured. And I'd like you to listen to her account of those times.
When something like this goes on, the first thing, the Jews get hit. So my father lost the job because he was a Jew. Anytime the big deal goes on, the Jews right away, there's a pogrom, they start killing them. They used to go in the street and they could take a cane and put on the end of it a razor blade and chop, chop. Across the street, one of our neighbors, the boy, was killed.
So did they cause any trouble for your parents' grocery store?
Yes. Eventually, he had to move out. And they were throwing rocks at the windows.
That's what I was.
The Polish could say, "Oh, my son shouldn't see that I'm buying by you because you're not supposed to buy by Jews."
So as things got worse and worse throughout Poland and throughout Low Poland, there came a time finally when towards the end of 1942, my mother is now 22 years old. And at this point, she has a fiance. She's met a guy. He actually runs a distribution trucking business, bringing material between Germany and Poland. And her parents actually pull her aside and say to her, things are getting too bad here. Things are getting worse. You now have to leave. The fiance's family actually lived in Germany proper. And at that time, believe it or not, Germany was actually a little bit safer. Things weren't as bad in Germany. And they were working on trying to convince my mother to leave with him and move to Germany and to abandon them. And I'd like you to listen to my mother's account of how she left her family.
Their town belonged to Germany. So it was very quiet there. And the family said to him, "Come here." So he made up that for $4,000, they're going to take 4 people. It was him, me, and 2 of his friends. So I said to my mother, "How can I leave you under those circumstances here?" My mother said to me, "You are young and you have a life in front of you. And I lived through 1 war, and through 2 wars, nobody can live." And I didn't want to leave her. And she says, "You have to leave me. If you have a choice and a chance, you do it." I will never forget that I was on the truck, and through the thing, I saw my father. I couldn't say goodbye to him. You know, through the war, we always thought maybe life will come back the same way. But as I was going out of the city, I looked through the holes in the truck and I figured to myself, I'm never going to walk those streets again.
And sure enough, she didn't. So all these arrangements were made, but they never knew when the truck was going to be ready to take them. So without packing and without really being able to say goodbye, at a moment's notice, she had to get in the back of the truck with her fiance driving and had to leave. And as the truck was leaving, she tells the story of how she was looking through the holes in the truck and she saw her father coming home from work and she couldn't even go say goodbye to him. And that was the last time she saw her father and the last time she saw her parents. So I want you to again think about what it's like from a people's point of view. What would it be like when you were 22 years old with all that's going on around you to, at a moment's notice, abandon your parents and leave town, knowing pretty well that you're just never going to see them again? During the same time, from 1942 and 1944, during these 2 years, we'll go back to Bendine, Poland, and talk about what's been going on with my father's family. First, we have to talk about a little side note about Bendine, Poland. Bendine, Poland was a very large textile area, very successful in textiles and tailoring. There were many, many small tailor shops and homes. There were a few large factories. And in 1942, the Germans hired this gentleman in the middle here, Alfred Rosner, to move to Bendine, Poland and take over all of the textile manufacturing. And they were going to turn all of the little shops in order to build, in order to make German uniforms. And if you worked in one of these Rosner factories, they were called, you would be issued a Rosner work card, and a sample of which is here in the lower right. And if you had one of these Rosner work cards, you carried it with you all the time. And if you were ever stopped on the street by a Nazi, and questioned what you're doing and possibly rounded up, you would show them the Rosner work card, and that would show that you had worth to the German war effort, and you would be left alone and you would be freed. During this time, during these 2 years, there were multiple selections going on throughout Poland, throughout the cities in Poland, and in Bendine, Poland. So there were a number of selection processes where people would be hoarded into a local soccer stadium, the Hatchhut Stadium in Bendine. All the Jews would be lined up on one end of the stadium, and they would line up one at a time to the central point here, this circle. Someone would look at you for about a second and decide if you should be freed, or if you are young and strong and should go to a labor camp, or if you did not have a lot of worth to the German war effort and you should just be sent to death to Auschwitz. And I'd like you to listen to my father and mother explain the selection process.
They took me, my brother, the younger one, and they took mama and my dad. We all one thing.
Explain it to them, the selection. Yeah. They used to take Jews, go from door to door, or they said all the Jews tomorrow have to be in this place. And usually they took either a football field, a basketball field, some place that you could accommodate like 5,000 people or what. And they stood there and they selected people. They put you one person here, one person here, one person here, one person here, and you didn't know where the hell you were going. After a few of them, you had already the know-how what was going on. If a woman would leave a child standing next to her, or just leave it, they could take this woman and the chances would be that they would put her into a labor camp if she would be young and healthy looking. If she would be with a child on her hand, they put her in a different place and she would go to Auschwitz. If they saw men that they were young and healthy looking, they were putting them in one place.
And there were 1, 2, 3, 4. One go to Auschwitz, 2 go to the camp, 3 go to death, that's it.
So as I mentioned, there were numerous selections during these 2 years between 1942 and 44. And what happened was my father actually went to one of these Rosner work factories, and he bribed a manager and bought 4 Rosner work cards. As I mentioned, my father and my grandfather, they were butchers. They knew nothing about tailoring. That actually is a little bit funny if you would think about it, if you knew them. But they had these Rosner work cards. So they would go to the selection process with confidence, and they'd come up to this little circle and they'd show the Rosner work card, and they would be sent to field 1 and be freed to continue living in Bendine, Poland. Except finally, towards the end, in 1944, random towns were selected to be Judenrein, free of all Jews. And in 1944, that occurred in Bendine, Poland. No matter what you were doing in Bendine, if you were Jewish, you were going to be selected and be sent out of Bendine. And that's what happened in 1944 when my family was selected and separated. A little side note, by the way, is Alfred Rosner, as I mentioned, he was German and he was not Jewish, but he was not a Nazi. And he actually knew what was going on. He knew people were buying the work cards and he approved it. In 1944, the Nazis found out about this and they arrested him. They put him in jail in 1944 and he was killed in jail. He died in jail for helping the Jews. He is now righteous among nations at Yad Vashem. So I mentioned that the Zaks family is now separated. My grandparents and my younger uncle, Uncle Shlomik, they're all sent to Auschwitz. My grandmother, who has no real skills, she comes off the train and she is immediately sent to the gas chamber and to be murdered. My grandfather, who was a butcher, he had some skills that were worthwhile, and he was sent to work in the kitchen. And Shlomik, who was still studying accounting in high school, he was put to work in the office. And a side story that we found out is that one day my grandfather was in the kitchen, and the story goes that I heard from my father was that he was slicing salami. My grandfather was slicing salami. It was the meat of the day, and people were lined up and they were serving them this meat. And online was a friend of his from Bendine. So he cut a larger piece of salami for his friend. A guard saw him do it, beat him on the head. He fell down and cut his head open. And being injured like that, he was sent to the gas chambers and was also murdered. And Shlomik, working in the office, knew that this was happening, and he voluntarily went with my grandfather to his death because he didn't want my grandfather to die alone in the gas chambers. These pictures that you see here are actually pictures that I took myself. My wife and I toured all of the concentration camps my father endured and drove the march that he endured. We went through Poland and we went through Germany. We did part of the trip actually with Alan and Judy. These pictures I took myself. These are of Auschwitz II, Birkenau. And the thing that I almost urge people, if they haven't already, is to somehow get there to see it. It is a very powerful and very overwhelming experience. The size and immensity of this facility is just, it's just scary and unbelievable even when you're standing in the middle of it. Each one of these foundations here is the foundation of a barracks that held about 300, 400 people. Each one had only one smokestack for heating the barrack. And you can see off in the distance, in every direction that I turn, you can see these smokestacks go on and on and on off into the distance. The number of people that were processed there is just very, very scary. I like to ask people, how big do you think Birkenau could be? And a lot of people don't have a good feel for acres. So I ask people, how many football fields do you think Auschwitz-Birkenau is? And if this was a live thing, I would love to get some answers, but I'll tell you that many people say 25 football fields, many people say 50. A few times, the highest number I ever got as an estimate was 75 football fields is how big Birkenau is. The correct answer is it's 357 football fields large. It's over 472 acres of a killing machine. So this is what happened to my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, and the youngest uncle. In the meantime, my father and his older brother, Shia, Alan's father, they're young. They're 25 and 26 at this time. My father's 25, Shia's 26. They're young, they're healthy, and they get sent to Blechheimer. And Blechheimer is a subcamp of Auschwitz that's only 30 miles away from Bendine. So they're actually sent not in those cattle cars that you always see. They're actually sent there in a normal passenger train. And a famous family story is Shia, Alan's father, actually snuck a bottle of liquor onto the train and got a guard drunk. And he and a few others jumped off the train on the way to Blechheimer and lived out the rest of the war posing as a non-Jew, always being careful never to speak Hebrew, never to speak Yiddish, because he didn't want to blow his cover. So they were separated. My father stayed on the train because there were a number of other relatives and friends, and he kind of felt that he wanted to help them and protect them. So my father went on to Blechheimer and was tattooed with the number 179085. I found a picture of him with a short sleeve shirt, and I can actually blow up his arm. So you can actually see the number tattooed on his arm. And he spent 10 months in Blechheimer repairing railroad tracks. There's a railroad station actually right on the other side of these trees, a big railroad depot. Towards the end of April 1944 now, the Russians are beginning to approach from the east, and many concentration camps start getting evacuated. And the way concentration camps are evacuated at this time is all of the inmates are placed on a death march. And if you don't know what a death march is, or it is a forced march of all the prisoners between concentration camps. If you cannot keep up, if you fall, if you hurt yourself, you are simply left on the side of the road to die. If you are still mobile, but you can't keep up and you're going too slowly, you're simply shot and left. The march itself, was a tremendous amount of abuse, very little food, very little water, and very little clothing. So they're placed on this first march, and from Blechheimer, they're marched to Gross Rosen. There are there's 4,000 prisoners leaving Blechheimer, and they are joined by 6,000 other prisoners from other neighboring camps on a death march to Gross Rosen. And through my research, I was able to find that that Blechheimer was actually evacuated. Now, remember, he entered Blechheimer in early April, April 1st, actually. I have some documentation. And this death march went on January 21st. My father always told me that he was in Blechheimer for just under a year. So that kind of fits, that's 10 months. So in the dead of winter, January 21st, Blechheimer is evacuated. And between the 4,000 people from Blechheimer and 6,000 from other neighboring camps, there are now 10,000 prisoners marching this route. I found literature and I found research that actually documented this death march and listed all of the towns that the death march passed through. And on my trip to Poland with my wife in October 2019, I actually rented a car toward Blechheimer, and we actually drove this death march. So can I say that I actually was specifically on the route my father took? Well, no, of course not. I can't guarantee it. We were on a car driving. But if you take this example, this town called Ukalazi and Nysa, in between here, there's all farmland, and there is only one road. It's almost a straight road between these two towns, and this is that road here. So we're driving along this road, and I can't say if my father was on this road or not, but he was certainly on it or to the left or to the right. And it makes me wonder, did Ukalazi look like this town square? This is the town square of Ukalazi when we toured it. And what was it, did it look this nice back then? And what was it like for the townspeople to see 10,000 men dressed like this in the dead of winter marching through their town? And also, how can you tell me that they didn't know what was going on when this happened? So these 10,000 prisoners marched 127 miles to Gross Rosen. It took 12 days, and 800 were murdered en route. When they reached Gross Rosen, again, I toured Gross Rosen. It is just immense. It goes on and on to the end of these trees, and they were actually cutting down trees to expand it at the time. And he arrives in Gross Rosen on February 2nd. And the documentation that I read, the research that I did, said that everybody who was on this death march from the east into Gross Rosen, that they stayed there only 7 days before all of them were transferred to Buchenwald in those infamous boxcars down here in the lower right. And now, as the Russian army is continuing to approach from the east, Gross Rosen is evacuated and everybody is moved in these boxcars to Buchenwald. And a little side note here is he arrived on February 2nd, and the documentation says, the research I found says that they stayed only 7 days. So that would mean he left somewhere around February 9th. In my research about Buchenwald, I found dozens and dozens and dozens of documents from before, during, and after the war. This document on the right was one of the more powerful documents that I found. And it actually shows that this is the transfer document of my father from Gross Rosen to Buchenwald. It actually has his Auschwitz number, which is tattooed on his arm on top here. I also learned that every time prisoners were transferred between concentration camps, many times they got new numbers. So this was the number assigned to him in Buchenwald. It has his birthday. It says that he came from Benzenberg, which is German for Bendin. Fleischer says that he was a butcher. This is the only document I've ever found about my grandparents. It actually says that my father is Herschel Zachs, who is also a butcher. My mother, his mother was Friedla Zachs. Her maiden name is Jakobowicz, and that they're in concentration camp Birkenau. This is the first and only documentation I have of that. It actually was signed by my father. To this day, I can recognize his signature. And most importantly, relative to those dates that I just mentioned, it confirms that he left Gross Rosen on February 9th and arrived in Buchenwald on a one-day trip, February 9th. So those dates that I found in my research of when he left and how long he stayed in Gross Rosen match up with this documentation. I also have an addendum to a document of people entering, of prisoners entering Buchenwald from Gross Rosen that was updated. There was an initial document on February 10th. On February 21st, there was an additional document of 2,460 new additions that weren't documented in the initial. And here is my father, Saul Joseph Zachs, and the number on this document is 124560, which matches this number up here. So it's really pretty powerful to actually find this actual documentation of when he entered and left certain concentration camps. So he's now in Buchenwald for only about 7.5 weeks, when in this case, the Allied forces are approaching from the north, and now Buchenwald is evacuated. Anybody who can walk and stand is forced on another, my father's second death march, but is forced on a death march south from Buchenwald to Dachau. Buchenwald is evacuated in early April, and Buchenwald is liberated only 9 days later. But my father is already on this death march. This death march, if you thought 10,000 people were a lot to be marching through the towns, this death march is everybody that was in Buchenwald, and it consists of 28,000 prisoners marching across Germany. A third of them die en route or were murdered en route. 9,000 people were lost on this death march. The death march was 220 miles, and exhausted and with very little food and very weak, they arrive at Dachau. Now, when I came to Dachau, again, there were many, many powerful moments during my tour of Poland and these concentration camps. This scene right here was one of the more powerful ones for me, and I kind of broke down here, to be honest. I'm getting a little choked up thinking about it right now. When you walk around Dachau, even now, all of these barbed wire fences and these gates and these trenches, they're all intact. The only way in and out of Dachau, both then and now, is through this archway in this building. So, and you can see from the size of the people that this walkway, this cobblestone walkway, has to be, what, 25 feet wide, maybe 30 feet wide. So I know I'm standing just within feet, especially when I enter through this gateway, just within feet of where my father marched on his death march coming into Dachau. So he's in Dachau now for a while, a few weeks. It is horrible conditions. Dachau now is holding about 4 to 5 times more people than it was ever designed to hold. There is a very serious typhus epidemic going on, very insufficient provisions. But finally, once again, the Allied forces are approaching Dachau. And on April 26th, Dachau is now evacuated. My father is placed on the third of his 3 death marches. He's marched from Dachau to Tegernsee on this path. And actually, this map, my wife found this map in the museum on the grounds of Dachau. I never was able to find the towns that this death march went through on the internet, but she actually found this in the museum. So he is on this death march, and in my research, I did find on the internet this picture, which is a picture by this gentleman, Bendo Ganter, from his balcony in Percha, Germany. And it was photographed on April 29th, and it was documented as, here is the death march out of Dachau South. Well, now I've got the list of all of the towns, and I can see that this list of towns in the museum on Dachau says that it goes through Percha. It left on the 26th, so 2 days later, they're passing Percha, and this gentleman took this picture on April 28th. So I certainly know that, again, it's very improbable. There's about 15 or 16 people in this picture out of 7,000 prisoners on this death march. So it's very improbable, but it's not impossible that my father is one of these people. And if he's not one of these people, he is certainly on this death march in the rain, passing through this town. The death march lasts a few days, it's only 70 miles. When they're sleeping out in the open one night, each night that they're on this death march, they just sleep out in the open. And they wake up one day on May 2nd, and all of the guards are gone. And my father is actually liberated on this death march by the Allied forces on May 2nd, 1945. So my father is now liberated, and he is with a friend of his from Bendine, Poland, that followed him, that was along with him for all these camps. And they now start figuring out how to start putting their life back together again. In the meantime, let's review these same years and what's been going on with my mother real quickly. We know that she was in Low Poland, and that her parents had her leave with her fiance to go to Germany. But on the way, they stopped in Krakow, where the fiance had a brother. And they stayed in Krakow for a few days when, notoriously, there was another selection process. The fiance was some form of engineer and was capable of doing a lot of repair work. So he was taken away and put with a band of prisoners that kind of were roaming the countryside under guard, but moving around the countryside, repairing bridges, repairing roads. And my mother was sent to her first concentration camp. This is a document from the International Tracing Service that shows that she also was placed in Blechheimer. I'm not sure that it was really at the same time my father was there. Even if it was, there was a separate women's camp in Blechheimer. But it has that she was in Blechheimer and what her prisoner number was. After she was evacuated from Blechheimer as the Russians were approaching, or I think it was actually much earlier than that, she was moved to Martha II, right? And there's a whole bunch of audio recordings that I have of her working with Werner von Braun on missiles that were being sent to, that were being shot at England. And my research shows that in Martha II, they worked out of an old clock and watch factory working on the guidance mechanisms of the A1 through A3 rockets that Werner von Braun was testing. It was when Werner von Braun finished testing the A3 rocket that he was ready to move to Peenemünde and work on the V2 rocket when Martha II was closed, and my mother was then sent to Bergen-Belsen, where she was put to work in the kitchen. And I'd like you to hear my mother's account of her being in Bergen-Belsen.
At that point, our food was impossible. We had bread that was green inside, and we had soup made out of the stuff that you give cows to eat. We were living at that point in a factory building that each room had about 120 women, three stacks up, the bunk beds, straw inside and very wooden, and that's it. Some of the Czechoslovakians told the girls that it's going to be very close, that that the Germans will get out. So I organized the whole kitchen, and we ripped apart a couple of beds, and we had knives and hammers and choppers. We were watching the Germans, that we were afraid that they were going to do us harm before they will run away. So we were watching them, we were prepared to fight.
So again, it's important to know that, although my mother said at the beginning that everybody was under the impression that if they just hang in there and just went along with things, things would return to normal someday. But after a while, they begin to realize that this is much worse than they ever could have imagined. And towards the end, they're actually fighting. Shaya jumps off the train in order to save himself. And my mother, working in the kitchen, actually collected knives and choppers and handed them out to the women in her barracks, because they were afraid that at the last minute, either the Germans or the Russians who were approaching also would harm them. So they were ready to fight. And at that point, my mother is actually liberated out of Bergen-Belsen by the Allied forces on April 15th. So now my parents still don't know each other. They're in two separate parts of Germany, and they're beginning to try to put their lives back together again. My mother starts heading back to Krakow. That was the last time she knew where her fiance was, and that was where she knew her fiance's brother lived. And when she gets to Krakow, she meets some people and basically finds the story that, yes, he was traveling the countryside with a bunch of men doing these repair work. Every once in a while, every evening, they would stay somewhere out, either out in the open, or they would sleep in barns. And when they slept in barns, every once in a while, someone would crawl in underneath the hay and try to hide. So when they gathered up the people the next day to continue to the next location, they would escape. They would miss this person. And one night, she learned her fiance did this. And on that same night, the story goes is that something like 20 or so other people decided to do it. So when they gathered the people up that morning, the guards realized that people were missing. They did a search. It was easy to find them in the hay, and everybody was shot. So she finds out that she's lost her fiance. He was murdered because he tried to escape. In the meantime, my father is roaming the countryside with a friend of his, and they're trying to figure out where they're going to go. And in the countryside, it's one night, it's getting late. The friend is actually not feeling well. He's got either a bad cold or the flu. I really don't know the details, but he wasn't feeling well. And in order to try and find a place to stay, and this is a story my father told me, in order to find a place to stay, they found out that there was a bunch of refugees being put up in a barn nearby. They went to the farmhouse. They were told, you can't stay in the house, but please go to the barn. They went over to the barn. They knocked on the door. A guy opened up the door. It was late at night. And he said, no, they're full. You can't come in. We have no more room. My father started yelling that his friend was sick and wasn't feeling well, and there's no place to go, and you've got to let us in. And he started really making a ruckus. And he heard somebody from inside the barn, obviously someone like who was in charge of the barn, I guess. He started yelling, slam the door on them, throw them out, get rid of them. They're disturbing everybody. Well, my father went a little bit nuts, and he burst in to find that guy, not because he was upset with what he said, but because he recognized the voice as his brother, Shaya, Alan's father, who was in that barn that night. And that is how my father and his brother Shire reunited after the war and found each other. Shire actually went back to Bendine and found his wife, Lily, Alan's mom. And everybody over a period of time settled in Stuttgart, Germany. So my father was in Stuttgart, Germany. My mother had friends in Krakow that were going to a wedding in Stuttgart, Germany. And my mother was all depressed. She lost her family. She lost her parents. Now she lost her fiance. And they forced my mother to go along with them to go to this wedding simply to try and get her out of her mood, to try and cheer her up. So she goes to this wedding. My father goes to this wedding. They meet. They get married in April of '46. And they both settle in Stuttgart, Germany. This is my brother, Irving. He was born in January of '47. And they spent 2 years in Stuttgart, Germany, applying for war reparations, which were never granted. I've got dozens and dozens of documentation of their requests and the documentation denying it, and trying to emigrate to the United States. Finally, in 1949, they emigrate to the United States. Here is the ship manifest of my family, Saul, Bertha, and my brother's name was Israel at the time. So new families are formed, and they're beginning to put their life back together again. My father moves to New York, and then the Bronx, and sets up his butcher business. Shia and Lily, my aunt, they moved to New Jersey. These are Shia and Lily, these are Alan's parents. And now we're in the United States, and the Nazis' final solution fails because my parents have 2 sons. This is me at my bar mitzvah and my brother. Shia and Lily have the other Jerry Zacks, and here's Alan, right? Between us, we have 9 grandchildren, right? I'll put a plug in for my 2 angels over here. This is my daughter, Cheryl and Michelle, graduating with her doctorate in political science, and Michelle graduated New York Medical College. There's a little plug for them. And in total, there are 11 great-grandchildren. So the Zacks family survives, and we start growing. So what I want to leave you with is to think about what's next. And what's next is really up to all of us. It's up to you, it's up to me. A pastor who was also a victim of the Nazis had a famous poem that had many stanzas in it, but basically says how first they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. And it goes on until finally they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So I want you to think about something like this. Can you tell the difference between these 2 pictures, right? They both have a single person on the ground. This person is being beaten and bloody. This person is being kicked and punched. There are bystanders standing around doing nothing. And the difference between these 2 pictures, if you can't tell, is this one is Low Poland in 1941 and a Jew. And this was 2 weeks ago in New York, in 2021, an Asian. I want you to think about how someday you're going to hear about Holocaust denial, and you're going to hear about slurs against Jews and Muslims and Asians and gays and Blacks. And what will you do? What will we do? Will we be the Alfred Rosner who will take basically his own life into his hands and jeopardize his own freedom in order to do what's right and what's morally, what's moral? Will we all look for and recognize the signs of injustice and never be complacent, because silence is complacency? And will we simply never forget? This is a map of all of the movements of my parents. It's pretty detailed. We won't go through it. I want to open it up for any questions anyone would have. And I also want to invite anybody, if they have an opportunity that they'd like to hear this story given to groups, schools, synagogues, churches, to please help me work on keeping the memory of Shoah alive. And if anyone is ever interested, I also have a second presentation, Recovering the Past, which I'll be giving to your synagogue in 2 weeks, about how to research the fate of one's family and how I did all of this research. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank the synagogue for inviting me and having me. And I hope this was okay for everyone.
Jerry, that was amazing. So Jerry, if you want to stop the screen share, I think all of us are just wowed by this extensive research, which was so amazing. And thank God you are coming back in 2 weeks to help us to figure out how we too can do such an amazing, just a beautiful piece. It was just amazing. Does
Oh, thank you.
anybody have any questions that, and wait, I see Janice. I think first of all, if everybody can do an attitude of gratitude. Janice says, thank you so much for sharing your family's history with us. And we all are thanking you. So if everybody can do an attitude of gratitude, that would be tremendous. So I think people are very emotionally, it was very emotional and really thorough. Is there any questions? If not, Cantor Kaplan is actually going to lead us in the Hatikva because again, one of the hopes is that we have Israel and that we like to end our show up programs thinking about Israel. But Stephanie Bonda does have a question. Yay, Stephanie. Where did your parents live in the Bronx? That's what Stephanie wants to know.
Bryant Avenue, I remember distinctly.
Bryant Avenue.
Bryant Avenue in these the 6-story tall. I actually remember the hallway and playing stoop ball there before we moved to Queens.
Marilyn Rose also wants to say amazing thank you. I think a lot of people just want to thank you. Any other?
Jerry, are you involved at all in any second generation, or are your children involved in any third generation groups? I put 2 websites in the chat if anybody does want to get involved, if they're in second or third generation. Have you been involved that way with others like that?
I'm involved in at least a dozen different organizations trying to give this story and help with research in any way I can. I did join 3G New York. I really don't want to say anything bad, but I was a little disappointed that they weren't interested in any of my talks. But I still am a member, and I read their information. I have to also, full disclosure, always a little disappointed that my children aren't a little bit more involved, but I'm sure they'll come around as they get older.
Jeanette, so Jeanette said, the for to the survivors to rebuild their life, to rebuild family and future. Thank you for sharing the courageous story. Daniel Leary, thank you for sharing again. Sharon, the Rain said, my father was liberated from Dachau, also on the same death march, the Rain, Sharon and Alan Rain said. And Victor Knight, thank you for sharing the amazing story.
I do notice that Heather Kaplan asked if they were provided any food and water. There's actually details of the march from Blechheimer to Gross Rosen. I'm not sure I'm going to remember the exact numbers, but I can get it to you, Heather. I know Heather personally. But they were given something like 600 grams of bread and 2 grams, some small amount of artificial honey, right? Like a margarine type substance. But that was it, just this small loaf of bread. My understanding is it was about that big for like 12 days and some artificial honey. And that's all that they were provided. Every prisoner got that one thing for the march, and they had to make it last 12 days. So they were given minimal substance.
Trudy Elbaum-Gottsman said that the recordings that you have are beyond valuable and that they would be accepted to the Shoah Foundation testimony. You know, so I don't know if your parents were part of any of the testimonies.
My parents weren't a part of the testimony, I'm disappointed to say. I approached the Shoah Foundation and they do not take simply audio. They only take video. So I could not donate it there, but it is donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. The full 2 hours is there with 60 pages of transcript and an additional 50 pages of appendices showing all of the research, how I did it, what I found, documentation. So it's a 110-page document that you can view, listen, and download from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you go there and you do a search for Zach's, the first one that comes up is my parents, simply because I think mine came afterward. And the second one is Lily Zach's, Alan's mom.
Wow.
Now, Susan, I think Susan was going to be recording this, Jerry.
I did.
And the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum will keep what you donated already. And if Susan sends it to them, as well as to the GSI, Survivors of the Shoah International newsletter, it will be available for researchers forever.
Yeah.
It will be available for researchers forever, and you did an amazing job.
Thank you. Thank you very
I'm
much.
sorry I didn't announce this, but yes, you were recorded. Well, Jerry knew he was being recorded because I asked his permission, and we will do what Harriet said. Harriet brought that to our attention earlier today. So thank you, Harriet. A lot of the other things in the chat are all praise for what you just did, Jerry. So I'm hoping you're enjoying what's in the chat. Leah Whitney wanted to know more about Rosner's. And again, the nice thing about this program is that Jerry's coming back to us in 2 weeks on Wednesday night. I think it's the 21st at 8 p.m. And he's going to teach us how he did all this. So anybody has any questions about the research, come back, because, and again, as a child of a survivor, this is extremely valuable for any of us who are trying to document our own family stories. So, and anybody can sign up. You could all sign up. At this point, it's exactly almost 9 o'clock, and I'm going to ask Cantor Kaplan to lead us in Hatikva as we conclude our Yom HaShoah program. If we can all rise, if you can. Again, Jerry, thank you so, so much. I think the accolades are speaking for itself, and we are so looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. We are also so grateful again to the Zacks. I personally am so grateful to the Zacks always, but Judy was the one that told me all about you, Jerry. So thank you, Judy, for bringing Jerry to our attention. At this point, Cantor Kaplan will lead us in Hatikva.
Please sing along with me where you are.
Thank you, Cantor Kaplan. Just some final announcements. We have tomorrow, actually during pop culture, at 10:30, the class that I teach, we will be doing Yom HaShoah Holocaust materials that have been in our regular pop culture. And actually, I'm very excited to present it. So if you are available tomorrow at 10:30 for the pop culture class, there will be more of Yom HaShoah related materials there. We also have the reading of the names, which is a really dear project, thanks in memory of our own Jerry Seppenwald, actually. So again, Harriet and Jerry, love of Shalom, presented us with B'nai B'rith, the reading of the names. We have an amazing committee this year, again, led by Matt Fisher, who has put together an amazing event. It begins at 11 and ends at 4. There are speakers in between. I think it actually begins at 12. But anyway, it's on our website. Please, please participate in the reading of the names. It's a mitzvah for no one to be forgotten. And those are the Yom HaShoah commemoration announcements for today. If you have any other questions, and again, 2 weeks from now to join Jerry back with learning how to document the way he did so beautifully. And again, thank you, Jerry, for really doing an outstanding job. You may unmute at this point and express your attitude of gratitude to Jerry and to the whole Zacks family. Have a meaningful Yom HaShoah. And I look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow and almost all of you also for the reading of the names on Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
This
for the
was
opportunity.
fabulous.
Very powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It
was an outstanding program.
Thanks, Steve and Judy, for having it every year.
Yeah, Judy, thank you. I forgot to thank you, Elfhelms. I'm sorry. But yes, Judy, always. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Very powerful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harriet, for keeping us aware of everything, too.
Your family, the Zacks family's